Great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sin Beng, and I head up EM Asia Economics Research as well as ASEAN Research as well. Joining me today, I'm delighted to be able to introduce Assistant Governor Encik Fra from Bank Negara Malaysia. Encik Fraziali has been in Bank Negara since the 90s, effectively seeing through multiple global crises, and has actually very ably navigated Malaysia through these crises and a wealth of experience. So we're delighted to have him join us today with this wealth of experience. On my left is Mr. Lee Heng Jui, who currently is Executive Director for the Social Economic Research Center in Malaysia. Prior to this position, he also served almost 15 years as Chief Economist for CIMB as well, and prior to that, he was also served in almost 15 years in Bank Negara as well in the macro department. And joining us remotely out of Singapore is James Sullivan, who's our head of Asia Equity Research based in Singapore. And not only is he serving that position, but he also serves in other positions, including as a non-resident fellow of the Asia Pacific Securities Council as well. So with that, what we'd like to do today is just to give you a sense of where we've come from and what we think we will face in terms of new challenges. And there are multiple challenges. There are already existing challenges, including demographic issues, which is not just specific to Malaysia, but also facing the rest of the world and the region as well. But I would say the new challenges over the last several years has been the rising issue of geopolitical tensions between US and China, and that's creating its own, I would say, challenges in the near future as we face some of these disruptions that we think could continue. And so with that, let me just open the floor with a question maybe to Jim. Maybe, Jim, if you can just help us think through the evolution of China-US relations over the last several years, effectively since 2016, and give us a sense in terms of what you're seeing from your perch in JP Morgan, as well as your unique position as head of research in terms of what the corporate sector, what investors are thinking about in terms of challenges, therefore framing not just what we think is going to be facing Malaysia, but also the region as well, and how Malaysia can actually position for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Sin Beng, and thank you all for the opportunity to be with you today. I apologize that I can't be with you in person, but very much looking forward to the conversation. So I'll maybe open with two linked but separate conversations. One, a quick overview of how I'm thinking about the geopolitical situation, in particular between the United States and China. And then two, how that is impacting investors' views to how to invest in equity markets across Asia. We are seeing a dramatic degree of flux, I think, which represents very meaningful incremental opportunities for investments into Malaysia. So first on the geopolitics, if I have to oversimplify the conversation, I would say we're moving from a dynamic going back prior to China's accession to the World Trade Organization, where there was a clear belief within high levels of the United States government that partnership with China would change China more than it would change the rest of the world. And the belief was that as the Chinese economy opened, that over time that would trigger a political opening and greater political freedoms within China, which was the primary driver. If we go back primarily to the narrative that was told by the Clinton administration at the time of WTO accession, that was absolutely core to the narrative, that trade would change China more than it would change the rest of the world. In hindsight, that hasn't been the case. If anything, we've seen the political trends in China heighten relative to where we were in the early 90s. The impact of Chinese trade on the rest of the world has triggered significant levels of global economic growth and triggered significant growth, obviously, within China itself. But really, we have not seen the political changes internally within China that was core to the US narrative back in the early 90s. Where are we today? We've seen a number of policy positions taken by several US administrations, not just the previous Trump administration. If anything, what we've seen is US policy towards China display remarkable consistency as we've segued from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. If anything, perhaps it's gotten more hawkish over the course of that transition. But now a very clear statement from high levels of the US government that China is a peer competitor to the United States. And whereas historically, US officials have been very wary of making statements regarding the containment of China, that is no longer the case. And it is explicit US policy now to try to reduce what are perceived to be US security risks triggered by economic and technological exposure to China, particularly on the trade side. And we've seen that inherent in a number of recent bills passed by the US Congress, inclusive of the recent Semiconductor Act, which is triggering close to $52 billion of US subsidies to bring semiconductor manufacturing back onshore in the United States. We can talk about whether or not that makes sense in the question and answer session. I have views on that, but we can come back to that. And so we've moved from trade will change China to China is a peer competitor, and that's had dramatic implications in terms of US policy across a range of issues relative to China. We've also seen a change in policy stance within China, and this is really contained within the Xi administration's move towards common prosperity. We've started to see the curtailment of certain industries in the name of common prosperity and overall Chinese security. In particular, we've seen relatively dramatic steps taken in the technology space. And that has triggered significant uncertainties within investors' views towards the future of China. We can talk later on in the question and answer session in terms of the logic behind some of these policies if folks would like. But if we leave it as there are policies that are introducing significant investor uncertainty, that segues to the second half of the answer, which is how are investors viewing Asia? How are investors viewing investments in this region of the world? That's changed dramatically. China, as we all know, is the largest constituent of the Global Emerging Market Equity Index, sitting roughly in the mid-30 percentile. And it's really been core to the conversation for investors, both in terms of asset allocation, but also in terms of build out of people and infrastructure in this region. That is now clearly up for debate. And we're hearing from more and more investors that investments in people, investments in infrastructure into China from large international investors is slowing, perhaps being curtailed. If we look at it from an asset allocation perspective, what we've seen are dramatic shifts of capital out of China and partially into the rest of the region, partially out of region. Into the rest of the region, the primary beneficiaries of that have largely been India and some of the larger ASEAN economies, inclusive of Indonesia. We've seen rising interest in markets like Vietnam on more of the frontier end of things. But the biggest thing that I would stress is that we're at a moment in time where we are seeing significant change in investor perceptions. Investors are very, very thirsty for growth in Asia. Malaysia has a very unique opportunity to step up, provide regulatory certainty, provide a reduction in the perceived risk profile of investing in ASEAN, investing in Malaysia itself. Investors are looking for places to put money in this region. And again, I would argue that Malaysia has a very interesting opportunity as a result of that. I'll leave it there and hand it over back to Sinbang and the rest of the panelists, but happy to interact with you as we go through the question and answer session.
Great. Thanks very much, Jim. And thank you for setting the stage for our next discussant. If I may just turn over to you, Heng-Jui, you've got a unique position sitting both previously in the private sector as a chief economist and also as a private sector observer now in your role as executive director in the Chinese Chamber of Commerce. From your perspective, what are the starting conditions in Malaysia like, given these challenges that Jim laid out? What do you think the prospects are? What needs to be done to create the ecosystem in Malaysia that creates opportunities for these kind of investments as they look for alternatives outside within the region? Thank you.
Thank you, Sinbing. Good morning to everyone, Tan Sri Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for Bursa and JP Morgan for inviting me today to participate in this very interesting session to talk about Malaysia's sustainability going forward. What are the challenges faced by not just the government, but also the business community, including your society after the post-pandemic. I have about 5 slides to share with you before we set the tone for our discussion going forward. Let me share with the first one. I think the title for today I'm going to address is all about structural reform. I think this is a good opportunity for government to look into all the 9 areas of structural reform which I'm going to highlight, and how do we move forward in order to make Malaysia more competitive. I'm happy to note that James are still very positive about ASEAN country, in particular Malaysia. Malaysia offers a lot of unique opportunity for the investor to come invest. Let me go through. Reform beyond pandemic. I think every time when there's a crisis, it reveals the structural reforms, structural weaknesses and impediment, and provide opportunity for the policymaker, whether it's Malaysia or government worldwide, to rethink, to reform and restructure how to make the better prospect going forward in terms of how to make your economy more resilient, right? I think Malaysia is no exception. I think everybody aware that after the pandemic, it had inflicted collateral damage on the society and economy. And that compelled painful adjustment to the new reality. It may be painful in the short term, but I think in the long and medium term, it will be very positive for any country, including Malaysia. I think Malaysia needs to be more prepared now on all fronts. When I mention all fronts, about fiscal space, about the economic and financial resilience, about the business vitality in terms of their competitiveness, social protection is important. As we observe after the pandemic, a lot of the people in the B40, even the M40, were pushed down to the B40 and even lower than the B40. So these are the problems that we are facing, and we have to build the resilience at all fronts to mitigate against a future shock. The shock can come from financial, non-financial, could be climate-related, could be geopolitical fragmentation, as highlighted by James, that reset the whole global supply chain. The supply chain will be not just your dominance in areas of technology, pharmaceutical industry, even the ESG-related, but Malaysia have to reposition itself, as we are still having a lot of competitors coming from neighboring countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand. So the structural reform which call for a very big reform-minded leaders and policymakers. I like to stress that. It's important. They must know what is good for the country. There are considerations in terms of electorate costs associated with the short-term adjustment, but many times it could hold back your reform, or your reform is half-baked. You know, it's not a complete or comprehensive, and we are not asking for very, sweeping reform. It may be something that you think what are the low-hanging fruits that you can reform to make Malaysia even a more friendly and better investment. And the medium and long-term gains are enormous. I think I don't have to explain that about investor confidence, enhance competitiveness, increase economic growth and productivity, and also to expand both the domestic and foreign investment, not just in the capital market, but the real long-term capital investment into all sector economy. And lastly, reform needs a strong ownership and political institution to execute. I think execute is something that we are quite weak. We hope that we have to improve the execution in terms of implementations of policy making and resolve the conflict, social conflicts, and also more engagement with the business community, which we are most welcome. I think from the Chinese Chamber side, we always want the government to have an open engagement with us in terms of before you announce a new policy, it's good to have engagement, and at least we know what are the anticipated impact on the society and economy. So I'd like to share with you the following what I call structural reform. I think I always mention about the courage to make reform happen. I think we know what needs to be done. I think the first thing is about the fiscal space. Yeah? The limited fiscal space requires the government to rethink on how to have a bolder tax reform, tax system, at the same time to reordering your expenditure between your operating expenditure and demand expenditure. We shall see in the coming coming tabling of the budget. So what sort of fiscal level, what sort of priority in the spending that want to bring Malaysia forward to become more sustainable. I think we are pushing for government to quickly implement the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is very important. In fact, from the chamber submission of the paper to the government is to come up with a fiscal council. I think that would give an added level of public oversight in terms of spending, in terms of how do you lay out your budget, a better fiscal outcome. And I believe with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, whatever proposal to raise the debt ceiling will not just within the cabinet of the government, but you need to table in the parliament to ask for permission approval to raise your debt ceiling. At the same time, to be more transparent on the future, whatever the current contingent liability. And the other thing that we are pushing hard for the government to do is the Government Procurement Act. We understand the government procurement could come to about 150 billion. It's a big percentage of GDP. I think you look at the current Government Procurement Act, it lack of details regarding to the legal implication in order to prevent the civil servant, the supplier, the contractors to collude, in terms of corrupt practices that lead to multiple leakages and public wastage of funds. I think that's something that we are pushing for. And I always, communicate to the Ministry of Finance that too much of borrowing and too much of debt is unsustainable. Malaysians need to relook at what are the areas that we can save on in terms of targeted subsidies, and also the cash assistance program need to be conditional, I think. The second reform is quite sensitive, political feasible tax reform. I think the thing that from the chamber, we have recently conducted a survey. All the business community welcome GST. We are okay with GST, but maybe start with a small rate, about 4%, and move on as the economy continue to strengthen. And in fact, we hope the government should announce in the coming budget, give us a lead time, 6 to 12 months to implement, maybe probably by the 1st January 2024. The other thing is about GST, and the other aspect which I think most of us need to be aware, including the corporates in Malaysia, is about the OECD domestic tax-based erosion and profit shifting, BEPS, which they will implement a minimum global tax rate regardless where you headquarter, okay? So currently we offer a lot of incentive for foreign multinationals to operate here. And mostly the incentive is so good in the sense that you don't really pay a high marginal tax rate. So with this global minimum tax rate of 15%, you'll be subject to 15%. Likewise, for Malaysian corporates who have HQ or enterprises overseas, they will be subject to this minimum global tax rate by the respective country jurisdiction of minimum 15%. But you need to have a euro 750 million worldwide to eligible for that. I think not many listed company will be affected except for like oil and gas industry, Petronas, etc. And the third structural reform, which is also related to industry community like us, is the business investment climate. I think we want a better one, a greener one, a sustainable one. The one thing that we always feedback to government is about the regulatory side. I think there's not much of coordination between the federal government, the state government, the local authorities. I believe not just the foreign investor also have encountered the same problem, but the local investor, whether it's our SME, large and medium-scale industry, continuously to face some obstacle in terms of the regulatory compliance costs. So we hope all this will be somewhat improved and improvised for Malaysia to be a very competitive place of doing business. So the next reform is about education sector and skill development. I think from the COVID, we saw how we struggle to conduct online education. Yeah, so we were actively involved in the working committee for the EAC. I think our Tan Sri Chairman also one of the members of the EAC Council. I think a lot of papers, a lot of proposals being put forward in order to improve areas like the skill, the STEM, in order to target more students, empowering them in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Look at the structure, the labor force structure for Malaysia. 24.7% skilled worker compared to other countries is much higher than that. I think we have to work on the level. And the other area is about talent. With the currency weakening, there will be more people going down to Singapore to work. Malaysia will continue to face the shortage of workers. This is one area that we hope the Talent Corp will enhance further the expert returning program and have a structured internship program with the local industry. And we talk the semiconductor industry. Malaysians, all these engineer students, when they graduated, they are not able to be straight away on the working floor. I mean, they are not ready yet. So they need to be going through a very thorough, maybe 3 months internship program in order for them to be more adaptable to the working environment. The other area that we working on is the TVET. The industry is working with the government agency in order to enhance the manpower quality. The other one is the healthcare. I think healthcare, we are underinvested. In fact, we've been pushing hard. We should do about 4 to 5%. That was 2 years ago when we have a dialogue with Minister of Finance. Then say 4 5% is large. But now, government realized they need to push for it. The latest proposal by the Minister of Health is for the coming budget, at least you spend 4 to 5%, because current level is too low. 2.59% of GDP is way below the benchmark. And in fact, we also push for the healthcare system, a universal healthcare system, and hopefully the coming budget, they will table the act. That will help to address what you call the concern about middle income, the bottom 40, as a lot of money spent on healthcare. I think mostly we have to target from preventive rather than the primary care, yeah? And the other thing is Social Protection Act. I don't think I need to elaborate much. This is an area where Bank Negara has worked a lot. In fact, we know there's a lot of social assistance program in Malaysia. They need to be consolidated. And the lesson that we learned from the pandemic 19 impact is that it hit a lot of the B40 and below, and most of them can't just have a very good social protection in terms of security of job, and that will impact on their future employability, future consumption, and important is to come out and streamline and have a better targeting. And the last slide will be aged care reforms and retirement saving. Cut it short, I think it's about aging society. We know it's very near us, but I think government's lack of concrete, a cohesive program to prepare Malaysia for the aged society. And the worst thing is after the crisis, the retirement saving will not be sufficient. After the 4 rounds of withdrawal, 145 billion EPF, now it's about at least 50% of the contributor aged 55 having less than 10,000 ringgit in their saving. Someone asked me whether the coming budget will be another round. I said, no, this is unsustainable. We cannot continue to give to allow them to withdraw in order to sustain a short-term consumption without thinking about the impact on their future retirement saving. And the other sector which we, after the pandemic, we realized that it's important to go back to basic agriculture, food crisis, climate change, ESG related. So I think I'm happy that finally the EAC, under the leadership of the Prime Minister, had agreed to look into some of the land farming issues, the tenure, the temporary land, where allowed longer, at least people give some certainty for us to invest in food production, and that will help. I think the other aspect to encourage the youth to come back to agriculture with the smart technology, and that will be making agriculture a more feasible sector to contribute to not just the food security, but also in order to reduce the over-dependency on imported food. I think Malaysia has a lot of items which are still high import dependency. We have to work towards that. The other area is about the logistic, distributional channel. I think whenever the farm produce coming to the final consumer, we find that prices are high. There could be some collusion. There could be some profit taking along the way. I think if we can work out, I think the supply chain will be more effective in terms of ensuring more affordable food. The last one is sustainable future, which fit into what we're talking about in the future. I think I'm happy to note that in the last 2 budgets, the Minister of Finance together with the BUSA also have worked out something, initiative program to start encourage the corporates, the business to go into green. And based on our survey from the Chinese Chamber perspective, a lot of them aware they need to go towards that, but they lack of all the capital, the skill. So these are the areas that we need to work on with the regulator on how to facilitate the transition towards ESG, and also don't forget about the impact at the early stage of the ESG, and also we are worried about green green inflation, ESG, when everyone is buying for ESG goods and services, there could be elements of inflation that would hit the final consumer, which may be a big topic to talk to later on. But I think just to, in summary, We think these are the 9 areas of structural reform, and I am happy that some of them are being taken by the regulator, the government, and I also understand that Bank Negara has been pushing hard some of the reform together to the respective agency in order to make Malaysia more conducive. I think I will stop here. Thank you, Sin Beng.
Great. Thank you very much, Hengri. I think one of the things that's quite striking about Asia is the fact that we're aging quickly, as you note. But one of the natural endowments in Malaysia, aside from the natural resources, is the fact that in terms of its relative demographic performance, it's actually looking quite good. Now, if I may turn to you, Assistant Governor Frap, what are your thoughts in terms of how Malaysia can actually maximize its demographic potential? Or are we actually looking at a demographic challenge as well? So I'd like for you to address that, please, and how we should move forward. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Sin Beng. Tan Sri Wahid Omar, Bursa Malaysia, JP Morgan. I want to do 2 things here. I get terribly excited listening to Henry outlining his nine major items for reforms. But I want to go back first, Sin Beng, if I may, go back to James earlier. When James talked about mega trends, what's happening in China and things like that. Now, we're a small open economy. There's no running away from the fact that whatever happens in the world has a huge bearing on us. Granted, the major drivers of our growth has been domestic. However, the color, tone, direction has much to do with what's happening around the world. So I want to zoom in one particular thing in terms of, when you talk about global value chain configurations. James touched on it a little bit. If you look at the studies by UNCTAD, for example, the way forward when we talk about global value chains is going to happen around 4 dimensions. Reshoring, diversification, replication, and regionalization. And increasingly what we see post-COVID is that an increasingly interventionist approaches by the respective governments. We've seen this. Earlier on there was the trade pact, and then we are seeing, for example, the French government going into the paracetamol supply chain to bring it back home, to bring it back to France. And then we hear about USChina Act, various others. If we were to zoom into the electronic and electricals, for example, where Malaysia is big in, we are really plugged into the global value chain. There is a chart here that my team has prepared, and we can see that Malaysia is the 6th largest producer of semiconductor, and we are the 11th largest exporter of electronic and electricals. So the push forward towards reshoring with such highly interventionist approach will surely have an impact on Malaysia. All right? So we have US CHIPS Act, and everybody's getting into this act. US, Korea with their K-Belt chip plan, EU's digital compass, and then we have China's 5-year plans. So there is an urgent need for us to take heed of this development, take stock, and somewhat make sure that we remain plugged in. Now, the good news here, as you can see, not only we are plugged in, we are also have a relatively good relative comparative advantage compared to some of our competitors. Why is this happening? It doesn't happen without policy intervention. And this is where, I'll come back to what Henry said maybe later, but I just want to touch on this. So we saw during the trade war, in some circumstances, we are the net beneficiaries of that trade war between China and US. And if I may say so, we are well poised to somewhat take advantage of this situation. We have comparative advantage, and we have strong ancillary support in terms of the entire industry. That we also have high adaptability to production changes. What gets missed is that, granted, the R&D happens in Silicon Valley and various other parts of the world. But where we come in is our manufacturing prowess, such that we have the relative degree of adaptability and production optimization, such that we can cater to this. So I'm relatively optimistic that we can navigate our ways, but we can't take it lying down and hoping for the best. So that's for value chain configuration. Now, Sin Beng and also Henry, you talked about the demographic challenges that's facing us. We are getting old, and no amount of Botox will help us. So at the moment, we are still reaping the demographic dividends. We are still we are aging, but we are still a relatively young country. This chart shows the demographic bulge, and we are reaping the full benefits from it. However, within a space of 20 years, and when we talk about 20 years, it's a relatively short period of time. We will have, for example, now the proportion of population above 65 is about 2.5 million. In about 20 years, it's going to be around more than 5 million. And the number of workers per age population would come down from 9 to 6 in about 20 years' time. Now, the added dimension to this challenge are two things. Number one, as Henry has mentioned, we have severely depleted our age-old savings. Now, we spoke about the 145 billion withdrawals through the EPF withdrawal schemes. Now, on top of that, EPF has also come up with very, very horrifying figures, and things like, for example, how severely depleted they are. Like 3.2 million members have less than 1,000 in their savings. Now, so immediately the policy challenge is, and there is a long enduring effect on this in terms of our growth potential and consumption patterns. Number one, for example, there is less for them to be able to withdraw, for example, to buy homes, right? So there'll be knock-on effects that will be quite enduring. There'll be less, for example, ability to withdraw for the sake of education, right? And they will have implications in terms of our capability to, reskill and retool. Granted, there are, for example, EPF mandatory top-ups, but ultimately, that's a challenge that's going to be with us for quite some time. The second thing, despite having these demographic dividends, is that the brain drain, right? By some estimates, we talk about 500,000 high-skilled Malaysians living abroad. But under current circumstances, post-pandemic, granted, the job market is increasing. However, the lure for higher wages, given the fact that the exchange rate in a neighboring country is highly stronger than us, the lure is great. And the other thing to note is the mobility of our current the Gen X, Gen Y, and Gen Z, Gen Y, and the millennials on their nomadic traits in that sense. So there is a huge pressure or constraints or loss of tailwinds in us benefiting from our demographic dividends. Again, it calls for policy actions. If you talk about EPF, we talk about replenishing the buffers in the next few years. Importantly, Henry has also talked about social protection. We have seen, for example, something like the minimum wage has spurred greater labor participation, especially among women. So these are the things for us to unlock further in terms of us benefiting from the demographic dividend. And importantly, and I'll come to this later, there must be sufficient investment, income, and job prospects such that you create higher quality and higher paying jobs here in Malaysia. I'll pause here. Thank you, Sinbeng.
Great. Thank you very much, Assistant Governor. Now, Jim, if I may turn back to you, I mean, you've covered generally the landscape for the region from a 10,000-foot perspective. Now, if we were to refocus in terms of the 1,000-foot perspective, what legislation, what acts coming out of the US and potentially China should we be mindful of in the next several months? I mean, are these, do you think this will further increase the existing tensions, or will they actually ameliorate the tensions? I just want to get a sense, at least from your perspective, what investors should be focused on as we navigate some of these longer-term challenges in the near term, if you will. Thanks, Jim.
Great, thanks for that, Sinbeng, and I very much appreciated the comments from the rest of the panelists so far today. So a couple of thoughts. One, I don't expect any ratcheting down of tensions in the short to medium term. There's two reasons for that. Obviously, we have the National Party Congress in October. In China for the CCP. I don't expect certainly any announcements prior to that. I don't see any opportunity for significant policy shift coming out of the CCP or China post the National Party Congress. I think it will be far more continuance. That's potentially a problem from the perspective that a lot of equity market participants are hoping for an opening up of the Chinese economy, a potential tempering of the zero COVID policy, and potential some degree of opening up to better relations with the US. I don't see those trends changing post the National Party Congress. And again, that's slightly counter to market expectations. I would say the market had built in a very positive outlook post National Party Congress this past spring. That has tempered to some degree, but I still do think that that mismatch of expectations versus reality is there relative to the incremental policy impulse in China. For the United States, the critical thing to note is that we are going into congressional midterm elections this November. These are very important elections. Historically, the party in power, which in this case is the Democrats with President Biden in the White House, historically the party in power has tended to lose significant number of seats in both the House of Representatives as well as the US Senate. At the moment, the Democratic Party controls both. They are expected at the moment to lose the House. They had been expected to lose the Senate, although some of the recent Supreme Court action in the US has changed that to some degree. The Democrats are currently forecast to hold the Senate and lose the House. But these elections are extremely important. I think it's important to recognize that any action that is perceived as soft on China within the domestic United States political environment will be damaging going into these elections. I think it is one of the only bipartisan issues that exists in the United States right now, which is taking a very hard stance on China. You saw that with Speaker Nancy Pelosi's recent visit. The critical element there is that wasn't the only visit. You had 2 additional congressional delegations visit Taiwan after Speaker Pelosi's visit. Again, I think it's just emblematic of the point that being seen as hard on China is a positive political asset in the United States right now. And so as we go into these very important November congressional midterm elections, the potential for any softening in policy stance from the United States just is politically unrealistic. So going forward, I think the critical things to watch, we've already seen the Semiconductor Act in the United States. That is an attempt to re-onshore significant semiconductor fabrication capabilities. We've published a paper saying that that's potentially short-sighted. I think the more efficient way for the United States to look at this is to look at partner nations, friendly nations with semiconductor fabrication capacity, rather than trying to take that all onshore. There are reasons why it's not onshore right now. Most of those are economic. There's also significant constraints. The previous speaker had highlighted some of the educational constraints inherent in Malaysia. The United States is no different. In the United States, there are not enough STEM graduates to fulfill the jobs that the Semiconductor Act envisions. And so you see the same delinkage between policy and education in multiple countries around the world, inclusive of the United States. The real key act to watch on a go-forward basis in terms of perception of policy risk is the Taiwan Policy Act. Our analysis of that at the moment is that that contains a number of policy statements that will most likely anger the CCP and the Chinese government. We don't see any of these announcements as structurally changing facts on the ground. It is far more sentiment driven than anything that will change reality, in our opinion, at the moment. But it will ratchet up tensions, and it will be perceived as a slight by the CCP and the Chinese government. We have to watch that space. There are currently versions that slightly differ on both the Senate and the House side. The way that public policy works in the US, you'll get a bill passed in the Senate, you'll get a bill passed in the House of Representatives. If they are different, they'll have to be reconciled. They haven't passed, the final versions haven't passed either side yet, and once they do, they'll have to be reconciled. But again, the political environment in the US is not pro-China right now. And so the odds of that act passing are not zero. And that would be problematic for US-China relations going forward. Happy to delve into additional issues in other questions in there.
That's fantastic, Jim. Thanks for laying the groundwork. And if I just may turn to Hengji.
To add on to the points mentioned by Fra on the global supply chain and James, I think we have to accept the reality that after the pandemic 19 or even after the trade war, this geopolitical fragmentation will continue to shape how to influence the global supply chain. No longer depends on economic efficiency or competitive advantage of industry in different countries. You'll be driven a lot by the geopolitical. Yeah, how do you position yourself? Yes, Malaysia is in the centric of ASEAN. It's good that we control about 7% of the global semiconductor sales, and it could be even higher now. But we have to position in terms of how do we dominance on the certain components of supply chain in order to mitigate the impact of all this geopolitical consideration when they decide where to reshoring and onshoring your production. I think we have to take advantage of that. I think it's good that at the pandemic time, I think the MIDA or the MITI had roll out a lot of incentive to attract not the existing company, but the new company that want to relocate from China elsewhere, come to ASEAN country, and Malaysia be the first place to consider. So in order for us to do that, I think we have to address some of the short terms, which I mentioned, some of the impediments or structure like skill, talent, the talent, the skill worker that we still need in order to support for the industry to move up the value chain. It will take some time, but the agency concerned will have to be very, open to feedback from the industry. They know better. They know better than the regulator, and be more open-minded. For example, in the issues of foreign workers. Yes, these are low skill, semi-skill, but at this moment when you open up, you need workers to ramp up your production capacity. You need workers to produce to meet your orders. So I think during a transition, we have to be forthcoming, to support. It's happy that they started to smoothen the approval application, but I think the arrival is still quite some time to go. But we see some easing on the shortage of the workers. I think on the long-term basis, we still need to be upskilling, reskilling. As I mentioned to you, the ratio of the skilled workers is still very low compared to other countries if you want to move up to the high end of the supply chain. I think the message here is that supply chain no longer depends alone on the economic efficiency of the country, but very much driven by geopolitical fragmentation. Yeah.
If I may ask a question to you, Hengri. I think this is something that AG Fra mentioned earlier. We really need to think about enhancing incomes and relative income distributions in the country to effectively increase, I would say, the productive capacity. Sitting in your unique position, speaking to private sector, what would you say would be the top 3 desired policy outcomes over the next couple of years from your perspective? Thank you.
I think from the industry side is what consistent with what Franz said, that enhancement, skill, empowerment. Yeah. So I think short-term measure that we have been seeing how government to be, part of the populist measures to give some cash handout, increase the minimum wage, but that had to be accompanied by productivity. Yeah, and in terms of the cash handout, I think there are some targeted schemes need to be in place rather than even the M40. Do you consider to give M40 the continued cash handout, or you want to segmentize further, which are the bottom of the M40? Yeah, so I think this is one area. Then second is that we have to encourage investment. Investment is something that we can talk. Yeah, we know what are the industry that create the high income job, but again, it fall back on the skill side. Yeah, you can bring a lot of industry come back. All the industry come in, but the first thing they ask you, do you have the manpower to supply? So it's a chicken egg issues where you need to be ready. And the talent there are 3. One is the local talent, Malaysian talent abroad, and the other one is a foreign talent. So we must have open-minded in terms of how to build up the base of the manpower to support the industry. If we don't have the local talent and the Malaysians still don't come back, you just have to open the gate for foreign talent. But once your foreign talent come in, there will be impact of knowledge. I believe so. And then your local side will also upskill. And most important, it's time for us to look at the program, the HRD, corporations, the training, the course, and also the TVET. We have been talking about that for many, many years. And I was hopeful when there was a change in government, they were talking about revamping the TVET. Until today, we still haven't heard about TVET. I think no. We are still waiting. Industry are waiting eagerly to know what would be the revamped TVET to support the industry. We're talking about ESG, we're talking about IR4, we had participated in the MITI to see where are we now, IR4 at the stage 1, stage 2. We are willing to work together, but things are not moving to the progress, the pace that we hope for. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Hengri. And if I may turn to you, Assistant Governor. As economists, we think of output as a function of capital, labor, and TFP. From your perspective, what's the best way to effectively maximize Malaysia's output in the near term and the longer term, either from a reform or just a capital enhancement perspective? Thank you.
Thanks for that, Sin Beng. I mean, it's music to my ears when we speak about structural reforms, right? But if you deconstruct structural reforms, it's changing that is easy to embark. And the issue is sometimes when you delay it too long, it becomes harder and harder. I mean, take, for example, the price controls, right? To the extent that actual prices and the control prices, the gulf between them have become so wide, then, any action to actually reform makes it a lot harder. So in that sense, when we talk about reform, the key thing is to manage the trade-offs, right? If you want to change, if you want to shift, you need to manage the trade-offs. There will be people, segments, industries that will be affected when we embark on structural reforms. So in that sense, we need to pay attention to trade-offs. The sequence also matters, which one comes first. Again, studies have shown, for example, between product and labor market reforms, let's come up with product reform first, to the extent that you can allow new entrants into the industry, create more activity, greater hiring, and then when you embark on labor market reforms, it's easier for it to pick up. So the sequence matters. And lastly, of course, it's best done when you have the money, wherewithal, resources to actually do it. So to the extent that growth is still there, it's a perfect time for reform. Now, why am I raising all this? I'm raising all this because as much as we like to pick issues and things like that, Malaysia, throughout our history, has been prolific reformers, right? It may sound incredible, but yet, if you look at in terms of our past performance, for every single shock, massive ones that even caused crisis, we have recovered with a V-shaped recovery, and not only we have recovered, we have instilled enough measures, ingredients, supporting act such that we operate on a new sustained growth path, right? So we've seen that time and again. And in fact, what we are seeing now, what Tan Sri Wahid earlier on alluded to in terms of how diversified our economy is, that's actually a payoff of the reforms that we did in the past. Now, the thing is, as much as we like that narrative, the tailwinds that have been supporting us, all this while, my staff call it 4C. You got China's growth, you got, for example, credit to some extent helping us. You have, relatively cheap labor in terms of infusion of them into some of our industries, and then of course commodity prices to some extent in the past helped to give us these tailwinds. Now, for each one of them, they have become somewhat problematic, which predefines our problem now. So whether we like it or not, we have to rebuild our buffers, as Henry has pointed out, and that has been our priority. So when we talk about immediate measures, there is a need for us to shift from the now to the longer term, right? So while we are talking about rebuilding buffers, while we are talking about helping the segments of society that are affected, there needs to be enough vision on the immediate steps on what we have to do, right? And we at Bank Negara, we have been very open about this. A few things that we have espoused openly would be things like, for example, the fiscal reforms, of course, and the fact that the fuel subsidy is untenable, but it needs to be accompanied with social safety nets. You need to help those who are most affected. So that the two comes together. And in the past, we've had a few attempts at doing this, but now we have for example, the database. We have the knowledge, we have the technology to help us, for example, in terms of payments technology. So we are well poised to actually do this and do it well, right? And in terms of investments, we couch it in terms of national investment aspirations, where it gives a lot of emphasis in terms of creating economic complexity, which is beyond just simple value added. We talk about creating jobs that creates higher paying jobs, not the ones that employ low-skilled foreign labor, and of course clustering. And we spoke about, for example, the E&E, how well invested we are in E&E with lots of comparative advantages, but it needs, like Henry said, to be married with some recognition of the socio-political and geopolitical dimensions to it. So in that sense, again, you know, we need to do certain things to fully capture the full benefits of the momentum that we are undertaking in reforming the economy. I'll pause here.
Great. Thanks very much, AG. And if I may turn to Jim for a second, I think something that Assistant Governor Farah mentioned was this idea of reshoring. There's also this concept of friendshoring as well. And I think there's a tension here between commercial catalysts versus non-commercial / geopolitical considerations. As you think through the next 2, 3, even 5 years out, how much of it do you think will be driven by geopolitical considerations sitting where you are, Jim, versus commercial considerations? And how could a country like Malaysia effectively enhance or increase its relative attractiveness both from a geopolitical and commercial perspective? Thank you.
Thanks, Sinbeng, for the question. And look, I think it's an important one because if I take a step back and if I reframe your question slightly, if you don't mind, Sinbeng, I think what we're actually talking about is the re-injection of national security concerns into the global economic conversation in a way that we haven't seen in 20 to 30 years. Post the end of the Cold War and a unipolar global environment, it was all about the most efficient liberal economic view of how to grow a country. That has now changed. And the injection of national security concerns into economic planning is a very important part of this conversation because it means a lot. It means, number one, we are building a less purely efficient global economy. So productivity will be structurally lower. Global economic growth will be structurally lower. The trade-off of that is the assumption that we will build a more resilient global economy. And the supply chain issues that we've seen as we've gone through COVID should be lessened if we successfully execute some of these policies. We've seen these issues before when too much risk builds up in an industry. The analogy that we use here at JP Morgan is going into the global financial crisis, there was too much risk built up in the global financial industry. We de-risked the industry, but if you look at it mathematically, returns on capital within the global financial services industry are structurally lower now today than they were pre-GFC. We're doing the same thing to the global economy with this injection of national security concerns. A very long-winded way to answer what was a straightforward question, Sinbeng. Yes, geopolitical concerns will drive significant portions of this conversation going forward because the focus has shifted. We're not looking at this from a purely neoliberal economics perspective. We're looking at this from a combined economics and national security perspective. What can Malaysia do to capture its fair share of this conversation? I think a number of the panelists have already hinted at that. It ultimately comes down to an understandable, consistent, favorable investment environment so that investors can plan and they understand on a 5 to 10 to 15 year perspective, which is critical, particularly if we're talking in the semiconductor space in particular. That long-term, understandable time horizon is absolutely critical to the conversation, but so is the human element. And so the conversation that's already occurred in terms of skills training is absolutely critical. The most exciting thing about that from my perspective, and I'm not an economist, I've been a markets guy for a long time, and markets are driven by incremental rate of change. They're not driven by absolute current levels. And so the statistic that was shared earlier with 26% roughly of the Malaysian workforce sitting in that skilled labor force bucket, there's two ways of viewing that. One, it is lower than some regional comps, but with proper policy and proper visibility, markets will bet on the rate of change of that number, not the absolute level. That's occurring critically at a moment in time when we are seeing generationally defining professional migration in Asia, between Hong Kong and Singapore, between other elements of this geography. So Malaysia has a very interesting opportunity to step up and capture its fair share of this rapidly changing geopolitical environment.
Thanks very much, Jim. And if I may turn this back to the market, since this is Invest Malaysia KL seminar or conference. In your view, what should investors do today to capture all these trends that we've been talking about, both AG, Heng Jui, as well as yourself, in terms of where the opportunities might lie, not just in the short term, but also in the medium term as well? Thanks.
Well, so first off, they should talk to JP Morgan analysts, would be the most obvious answer. But no, more seriously, I would say two things. One, the muscle memory of geopolitical analysis has faded because we had a unipolar geopolitical environment for the last 25 years. And so the number of advisors in the geopolitical space is significantly less now than where it was. The practice of that research is less well developed perhaps now than where it was. But I think also critically, the nexus of that analysis has room for improvement. From my perspective as a practitioner, a lot of the geopolitical analysis is narrative in nature. I've done this logical analysis, and this is my conclusion. A lot of the participants are people that have had either government positions or know people in government positions, and it's I either know or I know people that know. I think there is significant scope for doing more quantitative analysis in that space, and the tool chest that's provided to the analysts today is significantly different than where it's ever been. And so here at JP Morgan, we're aggressively pursuing discourse analysis, textual analysis, natural language processing to try to better understand rising and falling geopolitical tensions and how narratives differ across countries and across speakers and across topics. We're trying to provide and apply as many tools as we possibly can to this debate to try to change it from a very qualitative conversation to more of a quantitative conversation. And I think that's critical for investors to walk that road with us and to walk it on their own time and in their own way to improve the quality of insight in this space. But also, I think just the measurement of risk in markets needs to change. We've had a situation where we've effectively simplified all risks into a country-specific risk-free rate. I think we have to start to delineate this, and it's not just geopolitics, it's ESG concerns, it's other different aspects of markets. And I think we can get a lot more specific and a lot more discrete in terms of how we talk about, quantify, and price risk across these various criteria.
Thanks so much for that, Jim. And I think we're pretty much about time. And I'm also cognizant that it is Malaysia Day on Friday, and it's a fantastic celebration of how far Malaysia has come in the last almost 60 years. So a huge congratulations to Malaysia, the nation, but also thank you so much for my fellow panelists, to Assistant Governor Fra, to Heng Jui, and also to yourself, Jim, coming from Singapore, for spending time with us and for actually exchanging what has been, I think, a fairly interesting and insightful session and a very candid session as well. Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to share your views. Thank you.